Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Booklore podcast, where we explore the power of literature and celebrate diverse voices in North Carolina by spotlighting local writers. I suggest you cozy up, grab a matcha or any drink of your choice, and tune in. I'll be your host, Christina. Today, we have the privilege of inviting Ina Cariño onto this episode. Ina is an award-winning Filipinx-American poet originally from the Philippines. They are a graduate of East Carolina University and hold a master's in fine arts in creative writing from NC State University. Ina's poetry appears or is forthcoming in Diode, Poetry Magazine, Poetry Northwest, the Paris Review Daily, Waxwing, New England Review, and elsewhere. Furthermore, their debut collection, Feast, was just published earlier this year, focusing on themes of immigrant and diaspora identity with motifs of community, food, culture, and much more. Initiated in 2019, Ina is additionally the founder of the Indigena Collective, a platform that aims to center marginalized creatives in the North Carolina community and beyond. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ina.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So I guess the first question is really just, would you please introduce yourself? That can be where you're based currently, your current work, and anything.
Yeah, I'm actually in Raleigh, North Carolina right now. So I stayed right after I graduated from NC State. I'm still here. I really liked the city. I'm currently a barista and I enjoy it. It's more like a specialty coffee like career, but I am looking for teaching jobs. But I enjoy it. I do take it seriously. That's what I'm doing right now. I'm on the side writing, and I have another manuscript on the way.
Awesome. That sounds great. So let's just dive right in. So would you be able to tell us a bit more about your background and sort of relationship with reading and writing growing up? Basically, your journey towards becoming a published poet today. And that can include what writers and authors have inspired you as well.
So when I was little, my mom, who is an English teacher and professor of creative writing currently, really fostered a love of literature in all of us, my sisters and I. And we ended up just reading all the time, books that people thought were too advanced for us. We read when we were younger. Doesn't matter the genre, a lot of fantasy and sci-fi sort of snuck in there as well. And so I didn't really start writing seriously until I was in high school. But after that, I read a lot of Asian American poets who I feel that was formative to my writing. Li Young Lee is a Taiwanese American writer who is extremely important to me. His book Rose is pretty much what introduced me to what Asian American poetry can be. And then after that, I would say, just like reading contemporary living authors. Right now I'm reading Jenny Xie, The Rupture Tense, and I love her book Eye Level. Chen Chen and Franny Choi and all those wonderful people who continue to influence me as I write even now.
Yeah, awesome. I think that really goes to show how every writer starts off as a reader. So next, so in the Western world, poetry had a history of sort of being like socially acceptable and easily digestible literature before the American Renaissance, led by writers such as Walt Whitman in the 19th century. But since then, how do you personally think poetry has evolved and is still relevant in today's society? And I guess what role do you think today's social media also plays in the world of poetry?
That's a good question. So poetry, I think, is a vessel for revolution. I think that it's easily disseminated. It's easily, you can remember it, the words a little more than a novel, for example. And I think these days, in comparison to before, poetry was probably more for the elite, right?
Yeah.
And now it's sort of become this like people's vessel for revolution. And so I feel like the accessibility is really important to me. That's really key. And so, you hear about like Instagram poets and, I don't want to gatekeep that idea of being like an Instagram poet. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. If you're sharing your work, if there's thought and craft behind it, no matter how what stylistic choices you're making. I feel like that's a good way to show your expression. And not everything is going to be like my poetry from an MFA program. Not everything is going to be like an Instagram poet. So I don't like to gatekeep, because that too is elitist, right?
Yeah.
So I guess social media's role is popularizing it, and sometimes it can be a little too much, I guess, in terms of how or what we're sharing. And sometimes it is not great, but not great writing. But that too is subjective, right? So I think that right now it's a really good time, for example, to use poetry to spread these ideas about social issues, the social justice issues that are going on right now, especially with the presidential elections coming up. So I think poetry is a tool for evolution, whether or not it's online.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's pretty much stay true as it's evolved itself these past centuries.
Mm-hmm.
So your debut collection, Feast, was just released this past March, and it truly is a rich feast of lush imagery and literary nuance. So could you tell us a bit about the key inspirations for this debut and your journey towards creating your first collection? And additionally, could you tell us a little bit about what the publishing experience is like for poetry?
Yeah, for sure. So my particular book, the manuscript for this book was actually my thesis in grad school. And that's what your thesis is basically. It's a book, but it's not necessarily the same as what you put out there to publish. It's your attempt at a book, but mine was pretty much ready, I felt. And so I sent it out to different contests and publishers and presses who had open reading periods. And it ended up being about 2 years before I won the Alice James Award. It took me a year to write my thesis, and I ended up maybe spending 4 or 5 years total, because the publication process took 2 years. So it was like a 4 or 5 year process just to get this out into the world. And so writing it, and sort of what the motifs stem from, are a lot of my childhood. I spent a lot of my childhood in the kitchen with my family, cooking, and communal meals with cousins and aunts and uncles. And so it was really a big part of my life in the Philippines before I moved here, as it is in a lot of cultures, right? And so I wanted to highlight these motifs of food in a way that people could relate to it, even if they don't know what type of food I meant, for example. In regard to the publishing process, I would say each press is different. My press took 2 years to sort of go through the process with me. It's a little slower. Some people experience just a year, year and a half. It all depends on the press and how they operate. Working with my press, Alice James, has been amazing. I love them. They've been so generous with me, gracious about like things that I wanted, the cover art, the layout. They listened to me, we worked together, and it's been a really great process. They really took care of me. As far as anything else with the sending out and publishing, sometimes you just have to send it out over and over again. I think that I don't know if I would call myself lucky. I would just say that I'm really grateful that I was able to have my book published quite soon after I graduated.
Understood. Yeah. That totally lets in more insight about a real story within the publishing industry. So what does your creative process look like for writing each individual piece, such as deciding like prose and scheme types, as seen in like the unique structure of When I Sing to Myself Who Listens, or the more recognizable structure of Lean Economy Sonnet? Does the structure sort of flow out along with the idea, or is there more planning to best convey themes beforehand?
So one of the things that was instilled in me by my thesis advisor, Eduardo C. Corral, amazing poet as well, he told me that intention really kills your poem. Like, too much intention really kills it. And what that means is, if you sit there with a plan already in your head and you try to fill it out, it's kind of contrived. The planned aheadness sort of makes it fail a little bit. And so my process doesn't really stem from planning necessarily, unless I want to, write a particular form, but I don't plan the actual ideas that come out yet necessarily. I have a kernel of an idea in my head, but really what I do is I just sit down and I see what happens, on the page. Too much intentionality can kill the poem, and I believe that wholeheartedly. Process wise, in terms of everyday writing, a lot of people have an everyday writing practice where they take like an hour or 30 minutes every day, same time usually. I do not. Unfortunately, that's not how my brain works. I happen to just write whenever. I usually can't write at home, so I have to go out somewhere else, like a coffee shop or the library. Or when I was in grad school, I would go to my cubicle in the English department building. And so I ended up writing most of my book in my cubicle as like on, I don't know, that doesn't sound glamorous at all, but that's basically how I ended up writing a lot of my poems.
Yeah, awesome. That's great to hear. And obviously, it looks different for everyone, and I totally understand how your ideas of intentionality within writing affect the process. So you sort of touched on this already, but the topic of food and also language appears across several of your poems. So what purpose does it symbolize to you in your art? And I guess that can extend to what does poetry and music mean to you as a form in itself to explore identity, society, questions, all that sort.
Yeah. So food as motif, people mistake as exoticized culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to exoticize myself any more than anyone else wants to be exoticized, especially as an immigrant, right? Especially in this country. And I ended up wondering, how can I write all these images into these poems without being tokenized? Well, that's the thing. I can't help that. If someone is tokenizing me, if they're pegging me as the Asian poet who only writes about diaspora, I can't help that, and I shouldn't care, and I'm not going to. Audience is important to an extent, but at the end of the day, it's out of my control once I publish it, right? Once it's published. That being said, a lot of what I did with the form and the language in relation to those motifs is I made sure that I didn't italicize foreign words or what other people call foreign words in this country. I wanted to non-essentialize these words because they aren't other to me, right? They aren't foreign to me. And so with a history of, over the years on this earth, colonization has rendered many things. The standard is Western, basically, in many countries. But, Google exists in this day and age. Why is it always on the marginalized to do all the work when reading a creative work, especially? It's not an academic work, right? It's a creative piece of literature. And non-essentializing these words for me means a lot because it makes the white reader do some of the work as well. And I think there's a pleasure in making sense of a work while it's still a puzzle, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some part of my brain really enjoys like reading something and figuring it out. Why should it be easy for everybody, right? So that is something I kept in mind when I introduced food or introduced phrases adjacent to that. Yeah. And then what was the second part of this question?
Oh, just about like what poetry as a whole means to you as an art form to explore.
Okay. Yeah. So as an art form, poetry is definitely not therapy for me. People think of it as therapeutic, and it can be for some. It can be cathartic to write poetry.
Mm-hmm.
I don't find it to be therapy because the process of like going through like trauma or going through some emotions that are deep seated and that come out when you write isn't really therapy, because if you're like thinking about these things and you're aware of these emotions but you're not acting to fix something, or you're not like actively reacting to these emotions coming out, then that's not really therapy. Therapy is the work that you do after you realize that, right? Therapy is the work that you do after you sort of come to an idea like, this is what that meant from this memory in my childhood, right? So poetry is really the catharsis and the catalyst to that. It's the expression of kernels and nuggets of like, you know, like little bits of our lives. They are in conversation with each other. And the cool thing about poetry collections to me is that, yes, sometimes there's a theme throughout, right? Like mine has the thread of food as motif. But in terms of what makes it special is these poems can stand by themselves, or they can stand in relation to each other in the book, in conversation with each other, right? So that doesn't really happen a lot with fiction, unless it's like an anthology. But then it's also not quite the same because there are different authors, right? So poetry, to me as a whole, is the expression of these little bits of ourselves. It's the catharsis, the catalyst. It's the beginning of the therapy.
Yeah, 100% understood. That was beautifully put all together. I guess to follow up, do you have a favorite poem that you've ever written and why, or are there multiple?
I don't necessarily have a favorite, but I do have ones that are close to my heart, I guess. The very last poem in my book, It Feels Good to Cook Rice, is very dear to me. I remember driving home thinking about that phrase. It just popped in my head, the title, It Feels Good to Cook Rice. And remembering how when I was little, my grandmother would cook rice on the stove, not in a rice cooker, you know, in a cast iron pot. Very, very special to me, that image of that pot bubbling on the stove. And so I wrote this poem after that phrase repeated it over and over in my head. And it's one of the poems in my book that doesn't have a traditional form, or you know, it's not left flush on the page. It's sort of all over the place, and there's a little pattern here and there. But writing it too is free form. It's free flowing. Writing it was free form and free flowing, and I think that adds to its sort of meandering nostalgia, right? And I really hold this poem close to my heart because you know, it talks about the dead of this, you know, the elders, the ancestors of the speaker, as well as the present, like being able to create this ritual of cooking rice. And so the repetition of the phrases, the anaphora, sort of made it very ritualistic as well. So yeah, that's kind of why I put it at the very end. I feel like it is a little bittersweet, a little sad at the end, but it's also got a little bit of hope in there. And I wanted to end the book with a note of hope.
Yeah, that poem also really resonated with me. So it's really cool hearing your process and how you felt as well about it. So we're rounding off to the last few questions. Time has passed so quickly. But you also touched on this a little bit before, but is there sort of a common goal or theme across all your works, or is there not necessarily one that you hope all like readers and listeners necessarily take away from after reading?
I did touch on the fact that like audience is something you can't really escape thinking about, but also you can ignore it a lot of the time, because if you think about it too much, right? Like, for example, I could be pegged as an Asian writer only, but there is a through line in my work, not because I'm Asian, not because I'm an immigrant, but because I'm a person, right? And whatever sort of things that come to mind during a set of poems being written, like with my book, for example, that was where I was in the process of unearthing my memories at the time. Currently, the work that I am producing is extremely different from what I did for my thesis. It's completely different. There's not as much food motif. There's not as much mention of like culture and diaspora. And I feel like I have the right to be a poet that doesn't speak about those things as well, right? Because I am still a person at the end of the day.
Totally.
Yeah. And I think that it's very it's kind of foolish to think about audience sometimes. Not, I don't mean that in a demeaning way. It's just that you don't want to peg yourself as that along with the audience, right? You don't want to do the work with them of tokenizing yourself.
Mm-hmm. Oh, totally. So we are already at our last question, but lastly, do you have any advice for young writers or poets today, especially those of Asian American descent as well?
I would say don't be afraid to write your full self on the page, whether or not you're afraid of audience. Write your full self on the page, and you'll find that maybe there's something there you can always take away. You know, you don't have to show everything at once, but you can always take away, right? And then you can always add that later on. And one of the things I told my students in grad school, I taught poetry practice as well. One of the things I told my students repeatedly is to read widely, to read and read widely. Like, you can't say that you're a poet if you don't read other poets, because poetry is a big conversation, right? Mm-hmm. We harken back to the older poets, the older forms, the older topics, and we know what we know now because of what came before us. And yes, read the canon works, even if they're Western canon. And then that way you can subvert them, right? Mm-hmm. Know what you're subverting. So read widely is what I would say to young poets.
Yeah, thank you for that advice. That was wonderful. So to round off, please feel free to use this remaining time to shout out anything like your socials, where we can find you, upcoming news, releases, or anything really under the sun.
Yeah, my Instagram is pretty active. I'm active on Instagram. My Instagram handle is at moon.bow, BAO. It's kind of silly. And yeah, my website is inacariño.com, just my name.com. You can find my book on Amazon, bookshop.org, Alice James Press website. All those links are on my website. I'm doing some events in the fall. I post that all on my website as well. So yeah, thank you so much for letting me shout those out.
No, yeah, thank you so much for coming here today. So that concludes our episode today. Thank you, Ina, again for being here, and thank you everyone for tuning in. That's pretty much all from me and us. So have a great day, everyone. See you soon.